Good afternoon. I'm Beth Stroll with the TA Network for Children's Behavioral Health, and I'd like to welcome you to this month's System of Care Leadership Learning Community meeting. Today's topic is considerations for System of Care leaders in serving young children and their families. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the learning community first. Denise Sulzbeck and I co-facilitate this learning community. We hold it monthly, and it's designed to support leaders in systems of care in states, communities, tribes, and territories. And those of you are welcome with or without federal system of care grants. We designed this to support leaders in all different roles within all of those types of jurisdictions. We try to address topics that are important to you, and we do welcome your suggestions for future topics, so please let us know if you have some particular ideas or needs that you'd like us to address going forward. We'd like these sessions to be as interactive as possible, and we encourage you to put your questions and your comments, observations, insights in the chat box that you can see on the screen. And we will make sure that during the question and answer period, any questions that you enter in the chat box will also be addressed. We've saved about 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A period. Just below the chat box, you can see a box that allows you to download today's PowerPoint and some other resources that are in there now and others we may add as they come up during this session. And as a follow-up, you'll also receive a link to the recording of the webinar. Then at the end of the session, a link will pop up for a very, very brief evaluation survey. We really would appreciate your taking just a few moments to complete this and provide us with feedback. We take it very seriously, and we use your feedback to improve future learning community sessions. Before we get started, I'd like to also mention that our next learning community meeting is May 16th, also 2:30 to 4 Eastern Time. The focus of that one will be on considerations for leaders in developing trauma-informed systems of care. For that one, we'll feature an innovator in the area who implemented this statewide in Maine, Arabella Perez. Some of you may be familiar with her. And we'll also include examples from 3 systems of care that have done extensive work on trauma-informed systems of care and services. And so we hope you'll put this on your calendar and join us then. Again, today's topic is on considerations for serving young children and their families. We're fortunate to have a group of outstanding presenters. Neil Horan, who is the Director of Early Childhood at the Georgetown University Center for Child and Human Development, is the TA Network's lead expert in the early childhood area. And then we have 2 presenters who will provide very strong examples of systems of care that focus on early childhood, and we'll talk about the lessons learned from them. Adriana Molina is the Director of Project ABC at the Children's Institute in Los Angeles, and Debbie Allen, who will talk about early childhood systems of care in Massachusetts. Don't be fooled by her current position in Los Angeles as Deputy Director of Health Promotion at the LA County Department of Public Health. So now I will turn this over to Neil, who will get us started. Neil?
Thanks. Yep. Thanks, Beth. We are super excited to have a chance to talk with folks about early childhood. I'm looking at the participants list. It's always good when I don't know a lot of you. The ones that I do know, I fully expect you'll be jumping in with your knowledge of early childhood. We want this, as Beth said, to be as interactive as possible. Stop along the way. My lovely wife went to a concert last night. Think of me as the opening act that no one goes to, and then Adriana and Debbie are really who you came to see. They're going to really talk about what this looks like when you're trying to build these systems of care for young children and their families. I'll do a broad overview. I certainly am happy for folks to be sort of chatting in there in terms of your thoughts, but we wanted to sort of start with a sort of the big picture here in terms of what what is early childhood mental health? Why is this sort of different in some respects? And what strategies and resources do we have? And really, Adriana and Debbie will focus on that. And I'll sort of serve up a little bit about the kinds of things that we want folks to be thinking about. I can tell you over the last 15 years that I've been doing this work that oftentimes it comes from multiple directions, right? It's you set up you're trying to set up your system to serve children birth to 21, and you've started with the system partners and the work around working with older children and their families, and now you're trying to figure out, so now what do we do as we start to work with younger children? My experience has been, and we'll talk about this a bit, but that there are some particular things that certainly translate very easily, and there's some documents that we've written over the years. The TA Network, we just put out a document, I think last year. Beth will correct me because I'm sure I got it wrong, but we put something out around sort of what are some of the considerations, and we're certainly happy to share that with folks as well. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this, and I think it's important that we just all are on the same page just in terms of what we mean when we talk about early childhood mental health. I spend a lot of time in arenas. I was just presenting today at Child Care Aware of America's conference, so it's not that hard to talk about early childhood mental health with a group of 1,000 child care providers and administrators. But it's important that all of you really feel like, okay, when we're talking about this is what we're talking about. And so it really is, there are lots of terms that you'll hear when we talk about this. Some folks don't like to use the term mental health, and again, not that dissimilar from any age group that you're working with, but in particular with very young children, birth to 8, we really are talking about the well-being of young children and their families, and these three pieces here are pretty critical to understand because in some ways they impact who your potential partners are, who are some of the players in the early childhood universe, and what it is that we're trying to support when we talk about, a system that's supporting young children and their families. So the developing capacity of a child to, in terms of these three things, experience, regulate, and express emotion, that really is the work of early childhood. It's why we spend a lot of time really working with partners in primary care, in behavioral health, in early care and education, in home visiting, in child welfare, to help them understand what does typical development look like. Because quite frankly, from my perspective, school readiness is about being ready emotionally. Most people, even me, have learned their numbers, colors, and letters at some point, and I'm old enough that you learn that in kindergarten. You didn't have to be knowing those things, but there are a number of children who have more difficulty in terms of how they learn to identify and regulate those emotions. And so that's a pretty key capacity of the child that not only their families are dealing with, but also their other caregivers. Forming close, secure relationships, that attachment process that occurs very, very early on in a child's life is actually one of the few things that stays constant. So we know that when we do, if you think about what happens in the first 2 years of a child's life in terms of their development, as I think about my daughter Isabella, who's 2, she went from having to be carried everywhere. No, didn't change. We still can. No, I'm just joking. So she went from being carried everywhere to she's walking, she's running, she's talking, she's saying no a lot. And those kinds of things are all about the changes that occur, but they all occur in the context of that relationship that she has with Maria Jose and I. And those are important things because that sets up a child in terms of their social skills that we are all familiar with down the line. And lastly, it's about exploring the environment and learning. And when children are out there and doing dramatic play and doing all these kinds of things and people in their world are supporting that, they are learning how to problem solve and apply their cognitive skills. I put all this, and many of you may know this, but it's really important to keep this in mind because when we start to talk to partners in all the child-serving agencies, some of them may not have this in mind. The other thing that I will say is that all of this, the developing capacity of a child and these 3 bullet points, all happen within the context of family and culture, and how different families and how different cultures and communities view what it means to experience, regulate, and express emotion, to form relationships, and to explore the environment varies tremendously, so that the emphasis in some cultures, some communities, and some families may very much be on do not express very much emotion. In others, it may be you really should express your emotion in this way. Same with relationships in terms of how you form them and with how many people. So, we're so used to in the Western world this sort of nuclear family, but in many cultures, there is very much an extended family, and that is the attachment pattern. So I say all of that, and many of you may be like, oh my God, why is he saying all this? But I say it because I think it's important that we all start on the same page, because this is what, when we talk about our system, this is what we're striving towards. The other thing is that it's really about, it's not really about treatment. And that is, again, going to be one of the differences that you'll probably hear as Adriana and Debbie talk today, is that we talk a great deal in the early childhood world about promotion and prevention. And it's not that other folks don't. But the emphasis in many of our partners in early childhood, like Part C early intervention, like home visiting, and primary care, is really about promotion and prevention. It is not necessarily about treatment. We are aware that there are children and families who may be at higher risk, and we certainly want to do preventative sorts of interventions. And we want to sort of expand how much non-familial caregivers are able to address the social emotional development of young children. 60% of young children are in some sort of out-of-home placement, not child welfare out-of-home placement, but are with a care provider. Could be child care, could be Head Start, could be early Head Start, it could be family, friend, and neighbor care, but they are in some sort of place where somebody else, a non-familiar member, is providing care, and it is critical that those people understand social emotional development so that they are doing the kinds of things that help these children be as ready social emotionally as they can be. So I want to talk a little bit about why it's so important. This is a picture of Beth holding me at the first training institutes. I don't know if folks were there for that. So this is really important to sort of keep eye. This is older data. We certainly have newer data, but I thought I would just throw some things out there that we know that children with challenging behavior are much less likely to be successful in kindergarten, that it's the best predictor of juvenile gang membership and violence, and that there's much less success if we don't do something before age 9. And again, I'm preaching to the choir here in the sense that you all sort of know these things, and that's why we're doing the work that we do. When we think about early intervention and early childhood, you'll see things here that hopefully feel pretty familiar, and that is that when we think about the values, we think about family-driven services and family voice, that it's child and family centered, that this is really about what is sort of the child, as best as young children can express, but what is a child and family really, what's going to be in their best interest. It's about relationships, and you'll hear this a lot, and I think that at least part of the success of the work that's happened in Los Angeles that Adriana will talk about, and the work in Boston that Debbie will talk about, has been about the relationships that they've called across agencies, with their family organizations, with their evaluation partners, and things like that. Cultural competence. I don't think I have to spend a lot of time with a group of leaders talking about that. And then it's infused in natural settings, because one of the critical differences that I'll talk about here in a sec is that they're all not in the same place. With 9 and 10-year-olds, hopefully most of them are in school. We can sort of find them. On a typical day, very young children could be in any number of places. They could be home with their family. They can be in a placement, like early care and education, or Head Start, or early Head Start. They could be at their primary care doc's office getting a well-child checkup. They could be within the foster system. Obviously, that doesn't preclude them from those other places, but they could be somewhere else. So it's about infusing all of this into those settings. And then it's really grounded in developmental knowledge, understanding what is typical development and not saying that child has mental health issues because he had a temper tantrum and they're 2 and they had a temper tantrum that lasted 30 seconds. The other piece, and again, this should be familiar, and then I'll talk a little bit more detail before I hand it over, is that all those services and supports for children and families and caregivers are really the building blocks that are supported by strategic planning, all the same sorts of things you see here in these blue blocks here. But again, as I've said, it's about promotion, prevention, and intervention. Other things. So here's some similarities that I think it's important to keep in mind. And as much as I like to try and make believe that we have some special early childhood thing going, we're all talking about the same things. We're talking about building systems, and building systems have core system of care values. We are always concerned about how we build these up and how we maintain as much as we can of what's been built. And again, 2 examples that you're going to hear today will sort of underscore this. It is critical, and Adriana and Project ABC in Los Angeles, what's really of great interest to me in terms of their work has been how varied their service provision areas have been over the course of the grants that they've had in building that system because of the great diversity that exists in Los Angeles. Same quite frankly, in Massachusetts. Other similarities obviously are about how much interagency collaboration you need. And the truth is that oftentimes in the early childhood system, there may not be as many agencies involved with a 2-year-old. They may have only had contact with their primary care physician, and in some cases that's it. And so that means that we have to really collaborate and make sure, for example, that primary care docs are using appropriate developmental screenings and looking at social emotional well-being. I can tell you that the pediatrician I picked, for my children, we picked because they do developmental screenings. I want to know, is my child progressing, and do they take after their mother rather than their father, meaning we're in good shape. So, and then the natural setting. So I think with all those, you'll see, well, yeah, we do the same thing. Here's some ways to start to think about how it's a little bit different. And when I say different, I don't want to make out that, well, no one could ever understand the complexities of how different it is, but I do think that there are some differences here that are important to keep in mind as you're thinking in terms of your leadership about how you're sort of building up that portion of your system. The partnerships do look different. I think that the partnership that you might have with juvenile justice, for example, will be much more predicated around preventative sorts of things than may necessarily be the case. It may not, but it also doesn't preclude you from having the same sorts of partnerships. Juvenile justice is a great example of where we may not think about, well, there's no 2 or 3-year-olds who are incarcerated, but there's actually a great program in New York City where teenagers who were in the juvenile justice system who had siblings under the age of 5, those siblings were enrolled in a preventative social-emotional curriculum because we know that they're at higher risk. So that's an interesting example of a partnership. Substance abuse is another potential partnership. While, again, we may not hopefully have lots of 4 and 5-year-olds who are having substance abuse and misuse issues, they certainly are living with people who may. And they certainly are at very high risk of some of the impacts that come from substance misuse. And so, for example, we're working very closely in a number of states with substance abuse because of the opioid epidemic and what's happening with those children. I could tell you, sitting with Head Start directors in West Virginia and trying to figure out, well, what are we going to do given the high rate of opioid misuse in our state is an important partnership to develop. That developmental perspective is critical. There's so much changing developmentally between, those first 5 years that it's critical to start to think about it's critical to think about what does that mean? Who are our partners? And actually, in some ways your partners may shift. Part C, early intervention of the federal law, IDA law, is for birth to 3. And then Part B, you start to work with the school system. I'm seeing your comment, Lori, and I agree. We will talk about treatment. It is not to say that treatment is not a part of the system. I just want to make sure that folks have a sense that treatment is one part of the system, and it is not the main part in some instances, in that you have to start to think about prevention and promotion as much as you're talking about treatment. I think your comment, Lori, is very, very appropriate, that you are right, that there are a number of children. The prevalence rates for children birth to 5 are pretty similar to the prevalence rates for older children. So it's great. And it's actually a great segue. I think when I told you to set me up at 255 East Coast, you did a perfect job. So the diagnostic issues are quite challenging. The DSM-5 is not designed to work with very young children. There's actually a whole other diagnostic and classification system that 0 to 3 has developed, called the DC 0 to 5, which is brand new. And when we think about some of those diagnoses, they are not, you can't bill off of that diagnostic system. There has to be a crosswalk back over to the ICD. So those diagnostic issues are challenging. The other piece of that is to start to think about who's the patient. So even when we do treatment, if I have a 2-year-old who's demonstrating extremely challenging behavior, and part of it is because of whatever's going on in terms of the relationship with their caregiver, is the 2-year-old my patient? Is the parent my patient? Are they both my patient? These are the kinds of issues that have come up. Engaging families can often require some different strategies. Again, some of the families in early childhood systems have not had lots and lots of experience with the system, and oftentimes have had very positive experience, which is great. So in many of the systemic care sites, it was not necessarily super easy at first for them to identify what that partnership looks like. Again, I will tell you that the 2 examples we have are 2 sites that really did a great job of this. Youth-driven, again, is challenging in the sense that folks have done this in lots of different ways. They have taken, youth who did receive services when they were very young and now are a little bit older, and they have them help them inform the system. But asking a 2-year-old to sit and tell you what they think of the system is not going to be very useful. So it's being creative and thinking about what that looks like. The service array is I think, quite unique in the sense of there are, and quite frankly in the last 10 years, there's much more evidence-based practices both for treatment as well as prevention and promotion. But still, if you sort of listed out how many there are not hundreds and hundreds. There really are relatively limited. Workforce, as I travel around to some of the parts of the country where workforce issues are pretty huge, workforce shortage areas, the workforce in terms of early childhood is in some ways even a bigger issue. So funding sources, you have to start to think about where is this money coming from, from a federal level to a state or tribal or territorial level down to the community, and what do those funding sources look like? They may be less traditional sources like, EPSDT dollars, early periodic screening, diagnosis and treatment dollars. Valuation, again, given what we think about in terms of early childhood mental health, we have to think about what are we evaluating in terms of outcomes for very young children and their families. So I'm going to move on a little bit. The other piece is just to think about, again, keeping Lori's comment in mind, which I think is very appropriate, that we do think a lot more about promotion and prevention as well as treatment. And this is, on the left is from the Institute of Medicine, and on the right is a piece that folks at Georgetown did a while back. I'm pretty sure everybody's seen a public health triangle in their life, so I won't spend a lot of time, but it really is about sort of, you'll see this sort of theme throughout, that it really is about all 3 levels. So thinking about what strategies you use to identify who those partners are, Do you know who your Head Start Collab director is for your state? Do you know who the child welfare folks are who really understand early childhood? Who is your Part C person in early intervention? Who is your McV home visiting or your tribal McV partner on this? And identifying those partners and getting them to the table, and obviously getting primary care folks to the table, are critical pieces of building that early childhood system. This is a picture of this unbelievably beautiful woman with her nephew playing cars. Thinking about things, here are some examples of, treatment versus prevention. So parent-child interaction therapy is a behaviorally based treatment, evidence-based treatment as well, versus the Incredible Years, which is a preventative intervention, and then mental health consultation, which we obviously have a lot of faith in as part of an early childhood system, and the evidence base is currently building on that, and thinking about those services and supports is what's the sort of continuum that you're able to provide within your system. This is a pyramid model. If you are in any way, shape, or form associated with early childhood, you're required to say pyramid model every so often. This is from, there was a funded center called CEFL, Social Emotional Foundations for Early Learning, which has now morphed into the pyramid model, which has actually gone back because OSEP just funded them again. But essentially, this is a great workforce development, and that is underselling what it is, but it's really about getting all early care and education folks, and it's expanded to some other areas as well, but to get them all on the same page. What does it look like to have a nurturing and responsive have nurturing and responsive relationships, high-quality supportive environments in early care and education, and then at the higher levels, having more targeted or intensive interventions for children. I would tell you that, these are examples of the funding stream, and this is actually one of Kay Johnson's newer documents. Kay Johnson has done some of the seminal work in this area, but the Child Care Development Block Grant, which some of you may be very familiar with and some may be less familiar, is to think about this is people have actually used the Child Care Development Block Grant to start to fund mental health consultation. They've seen where that might be an avenue to fund some of the services and supports. Kristen, on the slide with the beautiful woman playing with her nephew, it's my wife. PCIT is parent-child interaction therapy. So that's an evidence-based practice. It's a little bug in the ear kind of behavioral intervention for young children and their families. Think about the workforce and where are they? They are folks who need to be able to work in Head Start, child care, mental health, primary care, all those sorts of things. And so it's important to start to think about that the workforce here is not just a mental health workforce, as we all know in our systems, but it's really the workforce that knows mental health and social emotional development and all these other places. As Beth mentioned, you can download the PowerPoint, so you'll have these. These are some resources. Here's a couple of resources on mental health consultation, because this is a critical services support in early childhood systems. Before I turn it over, I think it's in any systems development, it's obviously about building the new, and so when you're thinking about what you hear from Adriana and Debbie, I really want you to think about what's new and what I'm hearing. A lot, I think, of what I've laid out for you in an overview is, yeah, we know that. Thanks so much. Yeah, we do the same thing in our system, but that it's really about what's new and what are the sorts of things that we need to think about. So with that, I'm going to make sure that Adriana and Debbie have enough time, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to meet your wife via slide, if nothing else. And I appreciate you being the opening act and warming up, and I'm looking forward to sharing. I feel like I'm really getting the best part of this presentation because I get to share about things that have become passions and have become really new goals and new strategies that are evolving as we continue to grow. So I'm excited to share and also looking forward to answering any questions that may come up either now or later. So here's what we know. I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about Los Angeles and Los Angeles County, and I'm doing that because context matters. And if you don't believe me, try walking around in your bathing suit in an airport. It's just not the same as walking around your bathing suit in a nice, warm, tropical beach. So California is a large, expansive state, and within that, almost all the way at the bottom is LA County. And we have the largest population with over 10 million people. And within that context, we have over a third of those people who are born outside the U.S. So when Neil starts talking about, you know, the cultural adaptations and cultural implications, that's something that we are working with on a daily basis. And it also has the country's largest child welfare system. So we're looking at greater than 35,000 open cases on a monthly basis. And the part that is most important for us as we start looking at our work is that typically over 40% of them are 5 years of age or younger. And so that really starts changing how we look at how services are delivered and how we partner with child welfare, because in many situations our policies and practices in child welfare are the same for a 3- and 4-year-old as they are for a 12- and 14-year-old, even though the needs are significantly different. So within that, for Project ABC, we have even reduced the Los Angeles County areas that we focus on, because we're talking almost 5,000 square miles. Without traffic, it takes us 2 hours to drive north to south or east to west. With traffic, it takes us 2 hours to drive about 12 miles. But what's most important is that we're looking at all of these different entities, all of these different entities that are within that. 88 cities. So you're talking 88 cities, 88 mayors, 88 leaders that are there, 80 school districts. So even if what we're trying to do is get kids ready for school, how do you partner with 80 school districts? How do you engage all of these different people? So what we've done is we've divided it up into 8 service planning areas. And so in Project ABC, we actually started back in 2005. And that is the area that is just west of downtown. It's our metro area. It's densely populated. It's a high immigrant population, and that was in 2005. Then we reached into the South Bay area, which is diverse in a different way. It has the largest population of Cambodian immigrants outside of Cambodia. It has huge diversity in terms of socioeconomic status. It's large, it's expansive. It includes the harbor cities, which includes a lot of folks who work at the docks and recent immigrants from Latin America. And now we have gotten to shift our efforts in our expansion grant into South LA, which is the parts that you see in the news referred to as Watts, Compton, South Central, all of those areas. And pretty much the only things that are the same from 2005 to now is our commitment to system of care values and our PI, Dr. Del Arroyo. Other than that, we've really had to shift and adapt to very different communications, different cultures, different communities. And yes, Kristen, it is ridiculous to have that big a group and that much traffic, but when you're in it, and for me as a parent, sometimes sitting in traffic is my only alone time, so I've learned to actually value it and cherish it. So I've made peace with it. So I want to also share a little bit of a different graphic that we have put together to conceptualize our early childhood system of care. Many of the things that are that Neil talked about are here. There's a couple things that we've added in because we've seen this be important in informing treatment, and we've seen it be important in accessing our partners. So if you look at one of the areas that we've added is that data-informed practice. And we're not talking about just using the outcomes, but rather using data along the way to inform the treatment and the intervention that we are providing with families. So we have developed, as an example of that, our outcomes measures that are used for a national evaluation. We have different ways of talking about and illustrating the impact for families, including a report that's specifically designed for parents. We worked in partnership with our parent partners and our parent community to use language that was understandable, to use imagery that was understandable, to color code things and use pictures so that parents can actually be in partnership with the clinicians and with other service providers to see how treatment is shifting along the way, and to even understand concepts like, you know, sometimes things get worse before they get better, but they have a visual that helps them. So it's informing our treatment, but also informing our system at every level of the way. And then it informs, by having the families there, it also informs our system every step of the way to have parents present at our operations meetings, at our governance board meetings. So it's not just having family voice and asking people about their opinion of, you know, what services might be more helpful, but really getting their contribution in determining what are the suggestions that we make to our systems partners in terms of how to improve care for them. The other part that we have added, if you look at the bottom, it says trauma-informed / provider distress. And the provider distress, it's referring to the impact of the work on the workforce. So people talk about it as vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue or burnout. And so in order to put it in one term, we're using the term that Lorianne Perlman, who's one of the mothers of compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, is using these days. Because we cannot see trauma-informed systems not taking into consideration the fact that our workforce is impacted by trauma, and that the work of working with folks who've experienced trauma impacts our workforce. It's really interconnected and interrelated, and the trauma-informed is a piece that we added not just because it's kind of in vogue, not just because it seems to be that's what people are talking about, but because it's actually part of being culturally responsive. Looking at the communities that we serve, we cannot ignore the impact of trauma, including systemic trauma and systemic oppression, and, you know, the conversations that are currently in the news the past few days about implicit bias, and all of those things are really part of what we take into consideration with our system of care. And then if you see our little smokestack, We also called out social marketing because stigma reduction is not just a goal, but it's such an opportunity when we look at the conversations of prevention and promotion. You know, when you have young babies and toddlers and you are wanting them to be mentally well and emotionally well, everybody is cheering you on. When you have a 13-year-old with some kind of diagnosis and people start making up opinions about what the meaning of the diagnosis is, then it's harder to engage families sometimes in mental health services. So it feels like that's a really huge opportunity in terms of social marketing to start having families have conversations about the value of mental health and engaging with mental health services early so that it just becomes part of the resources available to their, in their community. And the other part that we think is really important in terms of stigma reduction is that a lot of times we think about stigma reduction in terms of helping families be seen in a different way or having families be more tolerant of a mental health diagnosis. But we also want to encourage folks to have a different perspective about service providers. So what's possible if we change the stigma about entering child welfare services? What's different if we can change the stigma about public early care education? So all of those service providers, and you'll see some examples of that when we talk a little bit more about our specific social marketing efforts. So with that, then we talk about some of the issues that Neil set me up for so well. Workforce. If we think about in 2005, we could say that workforce was our biggest concern then, and in some ways it's our biggest concern now, even though there has been huge progress. We have a brochure that talks about how to have professionals be endorsed in infant, family, and early childhood mental health as mental health therapists, as mental health specialists, so that people know who comes with this kind of thinking, who recognizes the benefit, the value, and the nuances of dyadic therapy versus the therapies that we were all taught in school. And when I think about when I was being brought up in my clinical practice, you know, we had one kind of child development, treatment class that had everything from talking about Bowlby and attachment to, I don't know, anything else about, teenage substance abuse, and it was all in one semester. And now we are recognizing that it's not just about what Bowlby found, but we need different interventions that actually support building these attachments, that support strengthening these relationships. And we need to start teaching how to do therapy with these kids in a different way, these kids being the young kids, in a different way than how we are taught to do them with school-age children, where you don't need a caregiver, you don't need an adult. And part of what we are seeing is that not just our direct line workforce, but also our supervisors, people who have come online, a decade ago or 15 years ago or even 20 years ago, and are now supervising folks who might be excited about providing services for young kids, but as supervisors, they're not informed about typical and atypical development, or why do we want to provide services for a 2-year-old? They seem to be okay. They're eating okay. They're growing. They're meeting their developmental milestones. And some of our younger clinicians are starting to see some things that they could really target in terms of prevention and promotion and treatment and are hitting some roadblocks with their supervisors. But ultimately, what we know is that we are increasing our workforce, we are training our workforce, we are increasing the use of evidence-based practices, even though sometimes those have their own challenges in terms of allowing us enough time to develop relationships with the families, and even though sometimes we know that evidence-based practices are not always the ideal way to interact with some of the families based on our historical context and our cultural implications, but we are working to create some systems that will support that. So what are we doing about all that? Now that I told you what some of our challenges are, let's talk about some of the solutions. So some of the solutions that we have in LA County comes through our partnerships. So the Department of Mental Health is working on a set of 5 core competencies. And these are training, some are half day, some are full day, that we want to encourage everybody who is working with young children, all clinicians who are working with young children, to participate in these trainings before or at least early on in their career of working with families. So one is typical and atypical development, so that we can start looking at the spectrum of behaviors, recognizing that behavior is the language of the child. Where is it that their behavior might be indicating that they have an additional need? And where is it that where their developmental status might be indicating that they need, that their relationships, their adult caregivers might need some additional support. Also, it includes trauma. Let's talk about the impact of trauma, because there's such different implications about how trauma impacts us between 0 and 3 and 0 to 5, which is different than how trauma impacts us when we're working with youth. Not to make either one better, worse, more significant, less significant, but it's different. And if we don't take that into consideration, then we may be providing interventions that are not really getting to the core. So to that, we need to also understand brain development and how to have some of those conversations. And I gotta say, from my perspective, as somebody who really has gotten the opportunity to work with and train a lot of paraprofessional or non-clinical folks and a lot of parents in our community, I really love the conversations about trauma and about brain development, because they are the same regardless of where we come from, where we were born, where we were raised. It really, in my experience, cuts through cultural differences, because fight, flight, and freeze, and if you talk to Bruce Perry, include flock, all of those happen to all of us, regardless of where we are living or where we are coming from. So those are really, to me, evening out the playing field and evening out people's experience and having them feel like there's something that they can do to support their kids and to make changes in their community. Our other solution has been our clinical leadership team. And what we have done with that is we have, on a quarterly basis and sometimes more often, brought together teams of people who are working with families to talk about what are the systems barriers that are preventing this family from getting the ultimate support or the ultimate care that we want for this young child. It's not about let's fix what's happening with this specific situation. It's not about let's make anybody wrong because they didn't do this or they didn't do that. It's about a real collaborative effort where we have had people in the room in situations where families have been involved with Part C and with child welfare and with mental health, and other systems, we've been able to bring everybody up in the room and talk about what is it about my perspective of what the family wants and needs, or what are the current risk factors, and how do they contrast to a different system's perspective about the wants and the needs and the concerns or the ultimate goals, and how do we partner together to inform our practices and inform our policies, and so that we can all make changes about how we communicate together, how we engage each other. And some of it is just about recognizing that we have common goals, but we don't share a common language. So how can we do that? How do we encourage that sharing of a common language so that we can recognize that we all have some very similar goals when it comes to the families? So that's our cross-agency care review. And then the other part that we've done is, everybody talks about funding, and one of the things that we are aware of on a daily basis is that we are temporary. We are a temporary solution, but we can also leverage the things that we have to expand our reach. So what we've done with some of the funding that we've had available to do trainings is that we have tiered costs for participation in our training so that we can actually earn some money to do more trainings and then be able to expand trainings to other folks in the community. So maybe have some of the professional folks pay for training that then allows us to provide same or similar training to parents or caregivers in the community, or just to allow us to repeat these trainings, because we all know that turnover is highly challenging, and there's nothing more disappointing than having somebody trained, whether it be in these core competencies or in these evidence-based practices, and then they go to another agency and take all of the training and the learning with them. But I think that's one that we've also made peace with, because even though we are a large county, there's also a lot of cross-service collaboration, or just finding ourselves in different areas. So even though we might train somebody in one part of the county, I wouldn't be surprised if then we find ourselves benefiting from their knowledge with a similar family in a different part of the county once they move and go to another job or another location or a greater opportunity. And the other part that I'm also seeing is that even though turnover is a considerable consideration, that brought from the redundancy department, or the Department of Redundancy Department, that's the one. What we've also seen is that means that people who were trained to provide direct services are starting to enter into some leadership positions, and they take that knowledge with them, because you can't unknow, you can't unlearn what you've already learned. So one of the things that we have learned is that one of the most effective strategies for us has been enhancing the role of the parent partners, really moving them to the front lines of everything we do, up to and including trainings. When we were in the last round of Project ABC, one of the things that we added to training contracts, when we were bringing folks from other communities into our community to provide specific trainings, we included as part of their contract a clause that said that they would either partner with one of our parent partners, or that they would find other partners whom they have worked with, or other parents or other families whom they have worked with in the past, to come be part of the training with them. So a lot of times, you can imagine that came with mixed results, but overall, we were able to have a lot more parents involved in training than we would have without that clause. So leadership and support has been key and consistent in making sure that the parent voice is heard, And that's coming all the way from Bill Arroyo, our PI, and all the way down to how we engage parents and how we talk to parents on a daily basis. It's not just the nothing about us without us. It's actually nothing without us because you may not have figured out how it's about us yet. And we want to make sure that we're there to let you know. So let's see. We are coming close to the end. I am going to ask for Beth's input. I think we're going to go ahead and
Right.
Do you want to go ahead and do the video, or do you want
yes,
to just
we don't really have time for that, so we will, if we do have time at the end, we'll show them. But if you can talk for a minute about sustainability, and then we need to turn it over to Deborah.
Yeah, see, I told you I get excited about these things. So we did want to have these as resources because they are concrete examples of some of the ways that we talked about partnering and changing the conversations about early childhood and what kids need. So the sustainability conversation, like I said, is something that we're aware of, and we've been even more aware of it right now in the South Central community that has historically had folks come in, provide services for a very short limited time, get what they need, sign off on their funding reports, and then disappear. So what we're really looking to do is, yes, take advantage of opportunities as they have emerged through other funding sources. First Five California, First Five LA have been places where we have been able to partner, but also really looking to initiatives that are going to be there after our funding ends, and where are the places where things like our cross-system care review can live after we finish. Things like the Department of Children and Family Services, our child welfare group, developing a young children and care committee that will be here after we're done, but that we are supporting and expanding the conversation about specialized services for kids 0 to 5. So there's a lot of different efforts that we have going on. Like I said at the beginning, I'm excited about the possibility of continuing this conversation with anybody, whether it be through the question and answer or offline, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Deborah. Sorry, Adriana. And now we're going to turn it over to Deborah.
That's just a little guidance. Would you like me to make a very clear effort to cut this short so there's time for more discussion?
You'll be fine with your 20 minutes. If you end at about 3:50, we're good.
Okay, great. So I am, as Neil pointed out, a recovering principal investigator for a launch grant and a system of care grant in Massachusetts. I moved to LA as if by coincidence. This is not an LA coup, but I moved to LA 4 months ago, and this is actually a nice chance for me to dive back into work that I'm very proud of that we did in Massachusetts, and it's nice to be reminded of it. And I had not thought about the work we did from the particular perspective of what did it mean to provide leadership for it, and as I thought about it, I thought it was useful to divide that into two different conceptual areas. One is to be very clear you're doing the right thing, and then the other is what do you do to make sure that you're doing it right. So my presentation is divided in that way. And I think in terms of thinking about doing the right thing, context, as Adriana said, is very important. And two particular things that I think contextually drove what we were doing in Massachusetts were a lawsuit, a class action suit that parents had won against the state, which was, of course, our partner in writing our grants. But the state Department of Mental Health and Medicaid in particular had lost a lawsuit which argued that there was not, a full continuum of children's mental health care in Massachusetts, and that as a result, kids were being stuck in the hospital. They were referred to as stuck kids. They were generally older kids with a defined mental health diagnosis, and other kids who might acutely need hospitalization were not able to get it because the beds were filled. So the parents won the case, and the remedy required an enhancement of the system of care primarily for kids with a defined mental health diagnosis, but it also required universal screening, which Neil mentioned, and I want to say a bit more about that. Then a couple of years down the road, what became clear, so that was in 2006. By 2009, it became clear that while kids of all ages were getting screened, and I think this is a very important point in thinking about strategies that highlight screening as if it were an end in itself, the services that happened for children prior to being sort of at the very severe level of needing mental health care really had not changed very much. So very little was happening for younger kids in the system of care, that is, the system in Massachusetts, not our grant, who were not already in the mental health system, but for whom the screening had indicated a need. So there was a gap defined around early childhood. At the same time, a survey we had done in Boston that replicated the National Survey on Children's Health, and lots of things in the literature suggested the really high prevalence of mental health needs among children across an age spectrum. So on the one hand, we had literature saying there's a need out there and screening confirming that, and on the other hand, we had a system of care that had been expanded with a court's force behind that, but wasn't effectively serving all kids. So we decided based on that to apply for a system of care grant in 2009, and we here is the state, and I worked for the city of Boston. I was the state's partner, and the idea was the state would be the lead agency, but we would be the laboratory. And I was at the Boston Department, the Boston Public Health Commission, which is the city's city's public health agency. And so we thought about in pursuing this grant. We then later that year went after a launch grant, and because we had gotten very excited about what we proposed for the system of care grant, decided to keep many of the same elements in the launch grant, which of course of necessity focused on early childhood because that's what launch is about. So I'll just describe what was in the system of care grant. So of course it was predicated on system of care eligibility, so the kids had to have some manifest mental health need at whatever age. And we decided in our grant to serve kids through the end of first grade, so around 6 or 7. And we made that decision. This is system of care. Launch had a defined age spectrum. We made that decision because we decided it would be very helpful to be with families through the beginning of entry into special ed so that we could support families through the IEP process. Probably one of the most important decisions we made in response to our focus on early childhood, because that was where the need was most sharp in the state, was the decision to house our services in the medical home. We felt very strongly that Massachusetts is, even in 2009, was a nearly universally insured state, and for children in particular, almost all kids even then were insured. Most kids had a regular source of care. We had very good ties in public health with pediatricians, and many pediatricians in the state had a developmental orientation. So that was a sort of natural partnership. But more importantly, we felt that with this focus on infant and toddler and early childhood mental health in both grants, that A, it was important to reach parents where they were at. B, it was very useful not to have the expectation that parents were going to think their child needed mental health services. And I can't overemphasize that as a difference between early childhood and older kids, is that it is very, it is very common when kids are in their, late latency, early teens, for parents to be breaking down the doors demanding services in the mental health system. That is not typically what you find in early childhood. The concept of early childhood mental health is not a widely shared perspective among most people in the United States. So we felt the medical home allowed us to get around that by being in a place where most parents already came, where there was usually someone that parents looked to as something of an authority on child development, where we had friends among clinicians who were being required to do screening now, which they mostly wanted to do, but had very limited resources about where you send a kid who screens positive, and therefore much more ambivalent feelings about carrying out the state mandate. So that became a very important decision. The second thing that I'd highlight as a really critical feature of our program was we decided that what we would pay for, what we would put in the medical home, was a team that included an early childhood mental health clinician, and which was typically a pediatric trained clinician, and we added a lot of training around the early childhood end of that, paired with someone we called a family partner who had to be a parent with lived experience. We had a few of our sites. We ended up across these two programs with 7 sites. And a few of the sites said, oh, you know, for the money you're giving us, we could get a social worker. We could get a clinician and a social worker. And it took a certain amount of forceful persuasion to say, well, if it's a social worker who's willing not to do social work but to function as a family partner and they have the lived experience, that's fine. But this really is a requirement of your contract with us, that this be someone who has been through this system and who can approach the issues that are coming up from a family perspective. And I think I will leave the rest of these points about structure for you to look at when you have the slides. Just because of time. Very important in understanding what we did in Massachusetts and how it worked was this very strong partnership between the state and the city. We ended up being awarded both the system of care and the launch grant and made a decision, and I have to say we were really grateful that SAMHSA blessed this decision, that although we would keep the funding distinct and be able to track particular expenditures on the 2 grants back to the particular funding source, we would have an integrated leadership team. So our leadership team involved the 2 state agencies that were the lead agencies on these 2 grants, and the Boston Public Health Commission, which was the implementation site for both of the grants. That part, I've left Massachusetts, but that partnership continues to this day, having met once a week since 2009. And I think that strength, I mean, it just meant, it was like the advantage of having, of not having incest. That's a terrible way to describe it, but you know, you spread the gene pool and you got a broader range of perspectives in the very direct leadership. So all the people on that team from these 2 grants, 2 state agencies, the city, are really cognizant about what's going on in both these grants and can share insight. In addition, it allowed us to create a single learning collaborative across the 2 grants, keeping fidelity to the different eligibility requirements to the 2, but sharing the enormous areas of commonality about how you effectively work with parents, how you integrate a parent along with a clinician into a pediatric model, and so on. And there were some real sort of clever strategies that got passed from site to site. Just by way of example, one of my favorites was a family partner who figured out that the only way to get a pediatrician to stop and listen for long enough for her to say a particular family had a particular need was to walk into the pediatrician's office and casually put her hand on the pediatrician's phone so that the pediatrician could not answer phone calls and interrupt while she was trying to have a conversation about a family. So those are the kinds of things that are never going to be in a textbook, but that all the other sides started nodding and, yeah, that's a great idea. I'm going to have to try that. And there were also strategies like that that were much more sort of got much more at the heart of the grant, like how do we teach pediatricians to have effective conversations with families about this notion of risk when you're talking about an infant or a toddler, and it is not obvious to the parent that there's a need to be addressed yet. This is just a graphic depicting the elements of the team. I think I will not go into them because of time. You can see the Boston Public Health Commission is there, the state agencies, and the rest are really important supportive elements around the basic partnership, including some details about where the sites were. So sorry to hurry through it, but you can go back and look at that. But then I think, so lessons I think are, in terms of leadership, being aware of the policy environment, aware of community needs, very sensitive to client needs and preferences, thinking about what is it like for a family with a very young child being told that your child screens in a certain way, and how do you then respond to giving them that information in terms of what you offer next. And then I think also very important for our project, I haven't talked much about this, but a clearly defined goal and a logic model that gets you there. That clearly defined goal for us was about getting Medicaid reimbursement for all the services you need to make this system work. And that's something the folks in Massachusetts are still struggling with, and something I think that's really key to sustainability. So that's the doing the right thing. The doing it right, the next one is just examples of doing the right thing that I hope people will take time to look at your leisure. But I want to get on to doing the right thing right. So some of that, I think, is attention to program design, as I've mentioned. Some of it, I think, is about shared ownership. And for us, that meant really creating a climate. So, where the state, where the city, we're giving our money out to mostly community health centers and then one hospital site, really thinking about how do we get them to feel like things like when we say you have to hire a family partner, it's not Big Brother putting requirements on them, but that there really is an underlying theory behind that, and that we are going to support them to make it work. So that's very closely related to the next point about a focus on customer service and recognizing that our clinical sites, as well as the families, were our quote-unquote customers. A very explicit quality improvement approach in terms of the learning collaborative and the notion that we never wanted our sites to feel ashamed or that there was a need for cover-up when something wasn't working. Oh, okay, you're not reaching Vietnamese families? We bet everybody has that problem. What are some things we can do to solve it, rather than a more punitive approach? Very important, I think, fidelity in terms of incorporating evidence-based programs, mental health modalities into this overall program, but giving sites a lot of flexibility about what made sense at a particular site for a particular group or with a particular family. So rigor, but at the same time about the interventions, but at the same time flexibility so that we could be family and community centered. And then I think really trying to make evaluation not something we stuck on or treated like a burden, but something that we highlighted as our opportunity to make the case that this intervention and in general resources for early childhood mental health were going to be something that could benefit families all across the state. And we really made a point of looking for outside evaluators. We had 2 in our first round of funding, and then there's a single evaluator who's now looking at the 2 follow-up grants that have been won in the state. And in both cases, the evaluators have been really important part of the teams, So they maintain their distance in terms of being able to be, rigorous evaluators, but they really buy into what the goals of the grants are and the programs are, and have some flexibility about helping us figure out how to get what we need out of the programs. Again, I'm going to skip over my examples. Some of them I've already referred to, but hope that you will look at them. I did want to mention the outcomes of our evaluation. This slide is an overview of what the evaluations involved. In each case, there was a rigorous quantitative data collection effort, plus a lot of qualitative data, things like parent focus groups, interviews with providers, because our logic model was that, we want this to work in the medical home. It has to benefit pediatricians and pediatric providers as well as families. The pediatricians have to feel it solves a problem for them. So that was also part of the evaluation. But this slightly complicated slide, I think, sums up our finding. This happens to be data from launch. We have a slide that looks very similar for the System of Care grant, but the numbers were smaller, so not all the outcomes were statistically significant. So I'm more comfortable looking at this. And what you're seeing is kids who entered the system at different ages from 1 to 5 years. The red line is the average ASQ-SE score for children entering at those ages. No, I'm sorry, the red line is the cutoff for clinical concern. So what you see is at under 1 year, very few kids entered. This is average for kids. At baseline is green, at 6 months in is the orangey, yellowy, and at a year is the blue. And those are approximate. Some kids we didn't reach until 7 months and 14 months, but approximately those 3 time periods. And what you see is in every single cohort, there was improvement for that age cohort over time. You also see that, of course, as kids go from 1 to 5, more kids are coming into the system at above the clinical cutoff for concern in terms of where the child screened. So results that we are very, very proud of in terms of having seen an improvement in the child's behavior and emotional development screening. We had similar results on screens that we did with parents. I haven't taken the time to present those, but would be glad to share. We also looked at, because of the challenges of getting hold of Medicaid data, we were only able to do this for the System of Care grant because we wanted to make the case that this is cost effective. It is, as I'm sure everyone on this phone call knows, really hard to show return on investment in early childhood because the costly expenses that you are averting often don't show up until the child is much older. So it's hard to show that you've saved money on hospitalizations for 3-year-olds because there aren't many hospitalizations of 3-year-olds. But what we did see, and there were 2 things that I think are very important. So this is making the point that we used a constructed comparison group out of Mass Health clients from across the state who matched our kids. It's called a method called propensity score matching. And what we found that was different was, first of all, that our kids cost less. They cost a whole lot less per member per month. But I think even more significant is that our kids, as they came into the system and were getting care, had a very different set of diagnoses from kids who were in the typical services. And, Massachusetts is not a backwater. I mean, these were kids who were in places where there is behavioral health in our community health centers and so on. So what they were getting would be considered, I think, standard of care, the comparison group, that is, in other places. And they were frequently being diagnosed with mood disorders, ADHD, and then a variety of other mental health diagnoses, whereas our kids, the majority were diagnosed with adjustment disorder, which I think implies much less labeling going forward and is a much more appropriate diagnosis in terms of being able to work with the child and the family through the team we put in the sites to resolve whatever is going on. So overall summary of the findings: improved parent and child outcomes, very positive assessments by parents and staff, reduced cost to Medicaid, a shift to less stigmatizing diagnoses, and I think importantly just demonstrating the feasibility of mental health integration in the pediatric medical home. And I've put up a link to an email address you can link to see more about the project as a whole. It includes things like what we did about social marketing. We had a very ambitious campaign that I haven't touched on, but I wanted to highlight these issues that I think are most critical for leadership. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much. And actually, I would like to thank all three presenters for some incredibly informative presentations with a lot of practical strategies. We have time for a couple of questions. I would like to go through those to see if they've already been answered. Laurie, earlier on you raised a question about making sure that treatment is also covered in early childhood systems of care. I know there was some response to that, but would you, as presenters, any of you want to add anything to the inclusion of treatment as well as the promotion and prevention activities?
Well, this is Debbie. So, I mean, part of what we were attempting to do, so we had the family partner, the early childhood mental health clinician, and then whatever resources there were in the sites that they were housed in. And all of the community health centers in Boston have behavioral health units. So what we were trying to do was have people sort of work at the top of their license and preserve, straight out behavioral health clinicians and with more intensive and long-term therapy for those cases where it was really needed. So our early childhood mental health clinicians provided brief therapy, but if there was a long-term need for therapy, they would generally refer out. So it was definitely seen as part of the continuum. And very often the family would stay as part of our system of care because we were also providing case management. So we attempted to sort of use those resources sparingly because they are so precious and so few, while we made them available as a supplement to our system.
Okay, great. Adriana, Neil, do you want to add anything to that issue?
I think the only thing that I would add is that it's one of the ingredients to systems change. There are plenty of other folks who are looking at what are the best interventions, what are the best treatments, and we get to learn from that. But I really see us as having a very different role in creating systems that are curious about these things. So yes, it is a part of the continuum, part of the system of care, but in as much as it helps us inform and continue to improve the systems that will continue to provide the treatment and the care.
Okay. Neil?
No, I'm good. Let's keep going.
Okay. We have another question from Beverly. How often are families that were not born in the U.S. asking for help, and are these services provided for the community? Any of you'd like to take that one?
Well, I mean, I'd have to say, having moved to LA, I think it would be impossible to run Adriana's system without serving families born outside the U.S. I mean, this really is a very a county with very diverse populations. I mean, in Boston, I think that was a real advantage of having the family partners, because in general they came from the communities being served and had much more language capacity than the mental health clinicians. I mean, we had one family partner who spoke 3 languages. I mean, language is a very important barrier, and there were obviously limits. I mean, we didn't have anybody where they spoke both Spanish and Portuguese and Vietnamese. So I think that is a limiting factor. We tried very hard to have cultural events at the community health centers, family game nights, trips to the Children's Museum that would bring in a diverse set of families and help them see that resources were available. So it varied a lot based on our language capacity, but we made an effort to do outreach to make the people we served as diverse as possible.
Okay, great. Thank you. I want to be respectful of your time, and I think it's time to end up. Again, I'd like to thank our presenters, Neil, Adriana, and Deborah, for their outstanding work. I wish we had more time, certainly, and there may be some more questions. If so, please email them to us, and we will make sure that the responses are emailed to you as a wrap-up to this webinar. Thanks also to Tiara Brown from the TA Network for handling all the technical aspects of the session and doing it so well, as always. A reminder to use the link that she put in the chat box and that will pop up afterwards for completing the evaluation. And finally, one last plug for our next Learning Community meeting, May 18th, Considerations for Developing Trauma-Informed Systems of Care. So thanks to all of us for joining us today.